Thanks very much, Matthew, and thanks for hanging around till the end of the day. It's been a long day. Now, what I have to say to you over the next 20 minutes, I don't know how far I'll get. I hope it's not going to be depressing. I hope it might make you a little bit angry and also feel empowered, because as the last speaker said, governments will only change if we force them to change. I used to train central bankers. I think Matthew asked me along today because I run a master's degree in the economics of sustainability, but I'm not really an expert in transforming the global financial architecture. So I asked a friend of mine who is, somebody called Fadel Kaboub, who's the chief economist at Power Shift Africa. He's a Tunisian. He's been working for that think tank in Nairobi for the last couple of years. And Matthew asked me about what the IMF and the World Bank and the multilateral regional development banks could do to assist with achieving the sustainable development goals. And I perhaps made the mistake of asking Fadel about this at the COP. I mean, I wasn't at the COP, but he was in Baku, and he's a very calm man. I've never seen him remotely as angry as he was then, and the initial answer was, as far as those institutions are concerned, not very much. There have been a number of incremental changes which have been helpful in recent years, a little bit more lending capacity, more concessional lending, lower interest penalties on countries that have borrowed from the IMF at a high ratio to their quotas or for a long period of time, changes in what used to be called structural adjustment programs, conditions on IMF lending, changes in debt sustainability analyses which feed into potential restructuring of debts in countries that are in default or at risk of default. But everything incremental, nothing transformational. This is what Fadel said to me. We're locked into a global economic system, talking now on behalf of the 1.25 billion people living in sub-Saharan Africa, which has evolved since 1980 in ways not of our designing, which have made it very difficult indeed to achieve, in particular, the first two of the Sustainable Development Goals. The way we're going at the moment, there'll be at least 600 million people living in extreme poverty in 2030, not having the right, the human right, not to live in extreme poverty. And there'll be about the same number of people who are described as living in hunger. And we have very, very low levels of income to define whether someone's in extreme poverty, and extraordinarily low levels of calorific nutrition, defining on whether you live in hunger as well. So when we look at actions 48, 49 and 50 of the Pact for the Future, we will accelerate reform of the international financial architecture to strengthen the voice and representation of developing countries, to mobilise additional financing for the Sustainable Development Goals, and to borrow sustainably to invest in their long-term development. Well, if we can take Power Shift Africa, which is very influential in at least a dozen African countries, and listen to what they have to say, this is what they have to say. We're trapped within a neocolonial economic system not of our design. During colonial times, we were used as a source of cheap materials and cheap labour, and we still are. The problem is not so much a lack of financing as the wrong kind. The problem is not a lack of debt, it's that we have too much US dollar debt and we're paying too high a rate of interest on it. The solution is not more US dollar debt, and although moving to a multipolar system is helpful, just replacing US dollar debt with Chinese yuan debt in the future isn't going to be all that helpful. Much discussion of reform is simply window dressing. Fadel would say, if he was here, that the climate and colonial debt that the high-income countries that we normally describe as the global north or the global south is massive. It's in tens of trillions of dollars. and the way international economic relations work. At the moment, it's as though the global north owes the global south $100 and gives the global south $1 and ends with another 9. That's the way the system works. Right. Now, I don't know if you're familiar, many people are, with Kate Raworth's donut model, which anticipated the Sustainable Development Goals. She published her model in 2012. And it's very similar to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 10 on the inner ring of her donut, 10 elements of the social foundations of a good quality of life, which everybody should have a right to, including, of course, food and sufficient income, energy, housing, but other things too. And then on the outside of her donut, there's the ecological ceiling that we all need to live within if we're going to have a sustainable future. 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Centre developed about 15 years ago. Now, well, since Kate published that model, it's been operationalised, including by, well, Kate's at Oxford, but by colleagues of hers who are ecological economists at the University of Leeds, Andy Fannings and Dan O'Neill, and a well-known anthropologist at the LSE, Jason Hickel. And I've chopped off the bottom of this chart. That wasn't very clever, but basically the idea is that if you're going to be in the safe and just space for humanity, the green ring of Kate Raworth's donut, which is where we should all aim to be, then you should be in the top left-hand corner of this chart. And you can divide the 150 countries that these people have analysed up into 3 groups. None of them are in the top left-hand ring. Someone mentioned Costa Rica earlier. That's the country that's nearest to living in the safe and just space for humanity. In the top right-hand corner, we have the high-income countries, and of course they are meeting all or virtually all of the social foundations. They should be, whether they are or not, in a position to provide people living within them the wherewithal to have a good quality of life, but they're way outside, and in some cases like Australia, very far outside the ecological ceiling. I should say the planet as a whole, we are told, is outside 6 of these 9 indicators of sustainability, and near another 2. The only one that's moving in the right direction is ozone layer depletion. These countries need to move towards the left. Jason talks about degrowth. We're not necessarily talking about a lower GDP, but we need to dramatically reduce quickly our ecological impact on the planet. And one of the reasons we need to do this is because another bunch of countries in the bottom left-hand corner, well, they're placing very little ecological stress on the planet per capita, but of course they're not able to meet at the moment the social foundations of a decent quality of life. And in terms of population, this is dominated by China and India and Indonesia and Bangladesh, but in terms of the number of countries, you can see lots of sub-Saharan African countries in that bottom left-hand corner. These countries need to grow their economies because they won't be able to provide the means for a good quality of life. They won't be able to lift people out of poverty and to ensure that people are not suffering from hunger without bigger economies. They need a higher level of income. Well, they need, Fadel would say, a more just global, not just financial system, but economic system in order to allow for this to happen. They also need ecological space, which we need to give them. Of course, there's another batch of countries in the middle who are not meeting a lot of people's basic needs, but are outside of their ecological ceiling as well, and those countries tend to have very high levels of inequality. The core problems are absolute poverty and hunger. I'm looking at those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I can't get beyond number 2. If you don't deal with number 1 and number 2, you may as well forget the other 15. A lack of progress is not restricted to countries with war or poor governments. A lack of progress, well, it sweeps across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. You can't blame individual countries when every country is in the same position. There's got to be something systemically wrong. And just to demonstrate this, you often see people talk about falling global inequality between countries, but it's something of a myth. You also see people talking about a decrease in certainly the proportion and even a little bit in the number of people living in extreme poverty or hunger. But the figures are distorted by, to an extent, India and Indonesia, but especially China. If you want to look at sub-Saharan Africa, and there are 1.25 billion people that live in sub-Saharan Africa, this is what has happened to their income per capita over time. And don't tell me that this is a symptom of a world with falling inequality. It's quite the opposite. And with the distribution we have at the moment, and with the ecological pressure we're placing on the planet, and the likely viability of economic growth in the future, if you mean by eliminating poverty, getting right down towards the bottom, to the 99th percentile, we won't do that in the next 100 years. Not with a given international distribution. We certainly could do it. Feder would say sub-Saharan African countries, but also countries in Asia and Latin America too, are in many cases in a trap. They lack energy sovereignty. Africa in general is highly dependent on imported refined petroleum. It has enormous, of course, resources in terms of potential resources in terms of renewable energy, but at the moment 3 to 5% of all investment in renewable energy happens in Africa around the world. So you're dependent on energy you have to pay for in US dollars. Africa imports, because of a shift over time towards cash crops, away from basic foods products, perhaps 50% of its food has to be paid for in US dollars. Africa is dependent on imported necessities, medicines too, but motor vehicles, manufactured goods, technology. This is what is being imported, priced in foreign currency. What does Africa export? Well, just as it did in colonial times, minerals on the cheap, increasingly low-price tourism, bits of global value chains, but the lowest value-added bits of global value chains. So we're talking about extractive, low value-added cash crops as well, generally foreign-owned export sector, where the profits are drained back out of the economy over time. It is not the case that there is a flow every year of finance into Africa. In the last couple of years, even excluding illicit financial flows, there's been a flow in the other direction. Africa is trapped. Most of these countries have trade deficits. They have structural trade deficits. They're exporting low value-added items. They're importing high value-added items. And for much of the last 40 years, the terms of trade, the price ratio has been moving against them. They have to borrow in foreign currency. They run trade deficits. They have to borrow US dollars to pay for their imports. They also have to borrow US dollars because they can't afford to let their currencies devalue. And so they need to borrow US dollar reserves in order to prop up their currencies. There's a perpetual fight for insolvency. And when an external shock comes along, a pandemic, thanks Matthew, or an increase in US interest rates, we've had both of those recently, countries are pushed towards insolvency, pushed back into the arms of the International Monetary Fund, which will not lend to you unless you pass a debt sustainability assessment. And passing a debt sustainability assessment will mean cuts in public services. It will mean austerity. So it will mean cutting back on spending on healthcare and education. They're a bit less severe now on that than they were, but they're still quite severe on it. It will mean privatisation. selling off infrastructure, railways, all sorts of things. It will mean, or it has in the last 40 years anyway, it will mean getting rid of regulations on foreign investment. They'll call it financial liberalisation. And it will mean, or at least it has for the last 40 years, since the 80s, signing up on free trade deals if you're not already signed up on them, and getting rid of tariff barriers if you've had tariff barriers in place, perhaps to try to develop diversified domestic industry. So these countries, many of them were colonies. They were decolonised in the late 50s or early 60s. They tried developmentalism. There were all sorts of things wrong with policies in those decades, but that's when the poverty rate fell rapidly in these countries. That's when ordinary people were lifted out of poverty, and we've seen it reversed in the last 40 years in these cases, because the global north has used its position as a creditor to enforce the kind of policies we often call neoliberalism on these countries, and it has not been successful. They've been in an endless cycle. Kenya has been into and out of the arms of the IMF repeatedly in recent decades. Okay, well, I'm not going to go through all this, lots of well-meaning window dressing. I've said they're easily derailed by crisis. Let me just show you, albeit I've only got a couple of minutes, but let me just show you and recommend you read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, one day. Which countries got into trouble during the pandemic? Was it the countries with the highest government debt to GDP ratio? No, that would have been Japan, Italy, the USA. The ones in red get to borrow in their own currency. The ones in red are what we call monetary sovereigns. They issue a highly traded floating currency, or if you're Italy, you've got the European Central Bank standing behind you, even though it's not your own currency. They don't have any significant foreign currency debt. They don't have to borrow in foreign currency. The Australian government doesn't have any foreign currency debt. So when they borrow, it's in their own currency, and the interest rate on treasury bonds issued by the Australian government basically depends on what investors expect the Reserve Bank in future years to use as the cash rate. There's no default risk here. You can never be forced to default on debt issued in your own currency. You can always cope with a pandemic. It's not going to be a problem. There might be a bit of inflation if you spend too much, but that's as bad as it's going to get. Not if you're in the global south. Your currency, there isn't really a big market for it. It's potentially highly volatile. You can't afford to see it devalue. The cost of food and energy will increase for ordinary people that are already living in poverty. You lack the space to make investments in moving towards an ideal future where you can work towards energy sovereignty. Africa can power itself, and Europe too, from sustainable energy. There's more potential sustainable energy reserves in Africa than anywhere else in the world, including this country. And feeding yourself again. 100 years ago, Africa did feed itself. Transportation links. There aren't good transportation links within Africa. It's all about taking stuff out to ports and sending it to China or the US or somewhere. The development of regional and industrial policies in a multipolar global economy and financial system. Why can we not transfer the technology so that every step in the value chain of developing solar energy in Africa is within Africa? Why can a set of countries not do the whole thing? The raw materials are there. Why could the technology not be there? And just to finish off, at the COP in Baku, what Fadel and his mates were asking for was $1.3 trillion a year of finance, a good faith down payment to the debt the global north has to the global south, mainly in the form of grants. That's not an impossible amount. It's a bit like the Marshall Plan. that the US used to rescue Europe after the Second World War in scale. What they got was, in present value terms, taking inflation into account, about $170 billion, but not until 2035. And actually, they already get $120 billion of climate finance. And look, from the private sector too, that's the expensive finance. And look, encourages some of it to come from the global south. They're expecting China to chip in. And it includes multilateral sources too. Basically, this is why Fadel was so angry. They were offered nothing at the COP. That is basically an insult. They were forced to accept this aspiration because they didn't discuss it for the whole 2 weeks of the COP until the final day. And then they nudged it up from 250 to 300 billion, and they said, what do you think Donald Trump's going to offer you? Take it or leave it. Power Shift Africa, my friend, said African leaders, or rather developing countries, were held hostage and failed to communicate that climate finance is not a charity but a responsibility rooted in historic accountability. The global north just isn't going to change its financial and economic relationship with the global south voluntarily. What Fadel and others are starting to talk about now, and is being discussed at the level of governments in Africa, is the fact that there are a variety of vital minerals where the majority of the known reserves of those minerals are in African countries. And that at some point, countries within the G77, or at least countries within sub-Saharan Africa, might have to use the same sort of approach that OPEC used over oil many years ago to exercise their geopolitical power, because it's not just we can't run our economies without cheap African labour and a range of materials that maybe we can find elsewhere. There are some things like cobalt and platinum where we are utterly reliant on African countries to supply us with those things in order for us to build a sustainable renewable energy powered economy ourselves in the future. So perhaps this anger is going to turn into a transactional approach to dealing with Donald Trump, and some form of change in relationship between the global north and the global south. Without that, reforms of the international financial system will be window dressing, and extreme poverty may never be eradicated. That's the end of the talk.